Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Pedestrian and Bicycle Transportation course. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation in this training. Please note that today's session is the second of a 4-part webinar series, with parts 3 and 4 next week. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the course presentation, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have, and I'll be dispatching those periodically to the instructor. Please note also that the handouts section of your GoToWebinar panel includes several PDF resources that we'll be referring to during the course. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to our instructor, Ron Eck, with the West Virginia LTAP Center. Ron, welcome back for day 2.
Thank you, Mike, and to all of you participating, welcome back as well for day 2. We're a few slides behind from yesterday, but that's not an issue. So I'm starting with, actually, if any of you are following with the handout materials, I'm starting with the slides that go with the day 1 materials and just made them part of my day 2 presentation, so I don't have to switch presentations. But Mike, if you would, before we start, maybe post the poll question. I thought we'd start with maybe a icebreaker type poll question, more on the lighthearted side today, informal side.
Yep, thanks, Ron. So we have launched the first poll question for today. What type of shoes are you wearing today?
I thought since this is a pedestrian bicycle class, that might be an appropriate question.
Yep, and already responses are arriving. More than 75% have voted. We'll give a few more seconds here.
I did this a month ago in another class, so I'm interested to see how this response compares to the previous one.
Yeah. All right, we have over 90% have voted, so let's see.
Great.
So Ron, 33% said work shoes, 13% said house shoes, 9% athletic shoes, 31% no shoes, and 13% said other.
Oh, wow, that's drastically different from the one last time. Last time I did it, it was like 67% were wearing athletic shoes. And I made the comment, they're ready to go outside and do some walking or running. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting though, very interesting. So thank you all for participating in that. So yesterday, we were talking about access management, and that's where we ended up. Another element regarding pedestrian travel and somewhat related to bikes as well is, in that it affects maybe bike facilities, is accessibility. And while this is not an ADA class by any means, since it is a pedestrian class, really ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and PROAG really affects pretty much everything we do with respect to pedestrians. So I did want to just say a few words about accessibility. As you may be aware, since 1990, ADA has required that pedestrian facilities in the public right-of-way be accessible. And currently we're operating under the 2011 proposed Public Rights-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, or PROAG, in terms of providing and maintaining pedestrian facilities in the public rights-of-way. And you see a couple types of mobility or impairments here, one mobility and one sensory. We talked about these yesterday, but I do want to look at, if I can get my pointer here, the image on the right here, the young woman with the cane. She is obviously blind. And in case you're not familiar with how a blind individual who uses the cane navigates, since this is a still image, we can't really appreciate it. But if we had a video of this, she would be swinging this cane in an arc in front of her, maybe 2 to 3 feet, sort of from side to side, maybe occasionally touching down on the surface. Some individuals may touch down more than others, but what they are looking for are what they call shorelines. That is an edge, a detectable edge that they can follow to kind of keep a pretty much straight course. And so what we see in this image, what is this, like a wall, a low wall here, that wall is a good shoreline for her. She can detect that, and that'll help her keep a straight path. There's probably another shoreline out of the picture down here on the lower right, probably a curb, right? Would everybody agree that at the edge of the sidewalk, there'll be a curb? Curbs are a good thing for the visually impaired because they can detect those, and that's part of the shoreline. But obviously for this fellow here in the wheelchair, a curb is not a good thing. It's a barrier for someone in a wheelchair. PROAG talks about what they call the PAR, the Pedestrian Access Route, PAR. And without going into the details, this is sort of a summary of the requirements of the PAR. It needs to be a minimum of 4 feet continuous clear width. The grade of the PAR, if it's along a road or street, if the sidewalk is along the road or street, it can be the same as the road grade. But elsewhere, when that sidewalk, say, departs from the street or might, say, swerve away, diverge from the street, then the maximum grade is 5%. In fact, the maximum grade for a crosswalk is 5%, which means the maximum cross slope on a street or roadway then is 5%. The cross slope of the walkway of the PAR is 2%, and the surface has to be firm, stable, and slip resistant. So that implies, say, asphalt, concrete, wood, like a boardwalk, if appropriate, slip resistant mechanism would be there, or same way with like a steel plank or something. But again, you have to worry about slip resistance with those surfaces. And it's not required, but my recommendation is that those surfaces be smooth, because for individuals in wheelchairs with certain types of spinal cord injury, vibration can be very, very painful. And so even, say, traveling over stamped concrete or paver block or brick can be very painful. So my recommendation to designers is to make the travel surface smooth, and then put any color or texture that you'd like to have in the environment, put that in the border area or in the buffer zones or frontage zones. And also, there can't be significant vertical discontinuities in the surface, like heaved up sidewalk slabs or that sort of thing. And you see the requirements there. There should be connections. We talked about connections yesterday. If your walkway or PAR is less than 5 feet, you need to have 5 foot by 5 foot passing spaces every 200 feet. And it's particularly important, I think, to pay attention to the placement of streetscape furniture. I don't want to discourage the use of streetscape furniture, street trees, bike racks, benches, trash receptacles, information kiosks. Those are part, to me, of a lively, attractive streetscape. But I've seen some communities where they're organized where it actually creates an obstacle course for both the blind pedestrians and for individuals in wheelchairs. So if you can kind of arrange your street furniture or work with your merchants and others in the community to kind of arrange things so that there's a 4 or 5 foot clear path, that would be better for the visually impaired and the mobility impaired. Be alert for protruding objects. Protruding objects are things that protrude into that PAR above 27 inches in height, like tree limbs, fire department connections. Sometimes if you have pole mounted traffic signal controller boxes, those kinds of things, we need to be alert for those. The reason they're an issue is that a blind pedestrian can't detect them with the cane because they're higher than the cane detection area. And so we should try to either eliminate them, like maybe lop off a low limb on a tree or a low branch on a tree or something like that, or else maybe put something under the protruding object so that somebody can't walk into it or walk in that area. And then also need to make sure we provide turning spaces for individuals in wheelchairs or who use walkers or crutches, so that they can turn and do their turning on a level surface. And when I say level, I mean 2% cross slope or less. So that's kind of just a quick overview of ADA, but it's important that we, of course, consider these things in our pedestrian design. And I mentioned this in terms of surface treatments, terms of paver blocks and so forth, joints. Again, remember, try to keep the travel surface smooth and put the texture and color maybe in the border areas. To me, would be good design practice. And of course, curb ramps, need to have curb ramps to allow folks to move between the sidewalk and the street. As much as possible, they should align with the crosswalk. Diagonal ramps should be avoided, use of diagonal ramps, since they direct pedestrians into the intersection and away from the crosswalk. And again, each curb ramp needs a turning space for wheelchair or walker, to people with walkers to be able to maneuver. And then of course, at the base of the curb ramp, there needs to be the truncated dome detectable warning surfaces to alert pedestrians with visual disabilities that they're entering the roadway or leaving the roadway. And so we should think about quality control both at the design stage. Be sure we review all sidewalk and roadway designs for not only vehicular movements, but for pedestrian safety and accessibility and some of these comfort and pedestrian friendly things we've talked about or will talk about today. And make sure both, say in-house designers or consultants, contractors, hold everybody accountable for good pedestrian design and accessible pedestrian design. And same thing at the construction stage, should evaluate the installation at the form stage, make sure your grades and cross slopes and everything are compliant. Then after the concrete's been placed, check it again. And if it's non-conforming, may need to be removed and redone. But be sure you do you or someone that you're directing does the actual measurements, and don't just rely on sort of eyeballing it. And people say, well, it looks good to me, I've been doing this for many years, but maybe they've been doing it incorrectly for many years. So this slide, if you're following the handout, this slide is not in either of day 1 or day 2. I added this yesterday, and this is not the best slide, but it might be better than me just trying to use words to describe something. Mike asked a question about, sort of what happens if there's a crosswalk that you don't want pedestrians to use. And we talked about you could post a pedestrians prohibited sign, but I mentioned that sign alone violates ADA because a blind pedestrian cannot detect that sign or get the message from that sign. So here's an example. Try to go through this quickly, but this is a small community in West Virginia. The road you see here where the pickup truck is, this is a state road, but the road down here at the bottom where my cursor is, this is a town or city road. And let's imagine they're going to resurface this street. And under Kinney versus Jerusalem, that court case in Philadelphia, it's, as many of you know, when you resurface a street or road, the curb ramps on the corners need to be brought into compliance with the current ADA criteria, current PROAG criteria. And so let's imagine this town is going to resurface this street, and they're wondering what to do about this corner, because notice there's some grade issues here in terms of trying to put in a compliant curb ramp. There's also, remember yesterday we talked about a single step. This is maybe a step and a half. But not only is this an accessibility barrier, but this is probably also a safety issue for able-bodied pedestrians. And what you don't see is on the other side of the street, down here where my cursor is a kind of unfriendly corner from the pedestrian standpoint. There's no sidewalks on the other side of the street, either along the state road or along the city street. And the state road makes a sharp curve. There's a lot of vegetation on the inside of the curve. There's no shoulder on the road. So it's kind of an area where you wouldn't want to send pedestrians into because of safety issues, not accessibility issues, safety issues. Drivers couldn't see them on the inside of the curve on that roadway. And so what this community might do is they might say, we're not going to put a curb ramp here. Because number one, notice there's some issues there, but a bigger issue is by putting pedestrians into the street here, they're sending them into an unsafe area. So they would document that as the reason for not putting in a curb ramp. But then how do you handle that to prevent the visually impaired from not going into the street? So what you might do is, obviously you have to regrade or reconstruct this section of sidewalk to put in a uniform grade here and eliminate that step and a half, if you will. So this would have to be rebuilt. But probably what I would do, and I'm just sharing with you my thoughts, I'd welcome other comments, is probably remove this concrete step sort of arrangement here and maybe curve the sidewalk around, and then put, just after I remove the concrete, fill this back in and get some turf or grass established. So this would be grassy area. And that would, that grass there, if you had a blind pedestrian coming toward us, down the sidewalk toward us, they'd be able to detect that grass and know that the sidewalk basically ends at this location, at least in the direction they're headed. And so they would have to follow the shoreline to get to this sidewalk. And actually there is a much more user-friendly crosswalk and sidewalk system at the end of the block here to the right. So that's one way to sort of end a sidewalk and let the visually impaired know that the sidewalk, they can't continue in that direction. What would make this more challenging, though, is if the sidewalk was right at the back of the curb, and imagine it was level, because then you can't really put in a sort of grass or some sort of other surface strip here. That's where I was saying you'd have to put in a barrier, detectable barrier of some sort here to let the visually impaired know that their path does not go beyond that point. So be glad to, those are my thoughts on that. Be glad to address any other questions or comments on that. Just put them in the question box. But now we're up to the day 2 materials. If you're following along with the handout, this is the day 2 package of materials. And this is what we'll talk about today. We'll continue talking about design and look at cross-section elements. We'll look at sidewalks and associated environments. We'll look at intersections, crossings, meaning crosswalks, roundabouts, and also overpasses and underpasses. So cross-section elements. First one we'll look at is lane width. And this is often an issue or concern for folks. The general thinking is nowadays that narrow lanes generally can improve comfort and safety for vulnerable road users, pedestrians, bicyclists. By narrowing lanes, you can create some space for, say, a separated bike lane, or maybe widen a sidewalk, maybe allow a sidewalk with a buffer strip, and also probably reduce crossing distances somewhat. And as I mentioned yesterday, the AASHTO Green Book really gives us a substantial amount of flexibility here. In terms of lane widths, they talk about lane widths between 9 feet and 12 feet, depending on the desired speed, capacity considerations, and the context of the roadway. Another issue is shoulder width. You think about it, if you have wide enough shoulders, that can improve bicyclist safety and comfort, especially on higher speed, higher volume roadways. The thinking is to accommodate bicyclists, a 4 foot or greater paved shoulder, continuous along the length of the roadway, should be provided, and 5 feet where you have barriers like a curb or guardrail or something like that along the road. And I would certainly consider wider shoulders if vehicle speeds on the roadway are greater than 50 miles per hour. When do we pave shoulders? The AASHTO Green Book gives some policies on shoulder width for different functional classes, and they recommend, quote, usable shoulders on arterials be paved. And I would say designers should consider paved shoulders to accommodate bicyclists and possibly pedestrians in rural areas. And here we see this is a small town in Mississippi, and notice they have a nice wide shoulder. There's a rumble stripe in the foreground. We'll talk more about that shortly. but the shoulder is wide enough and the surface is a hard surface bituminous material, so it can be used by bicyclists. Shoulders and different project types. We should think about maybe capturing opportunities to include or upgrade paved shoulders during all types of roadway projects. Weigh the trade-offs such as safety benefits for all users, construction costs, cost savings over the life of the roadway. And we have the next few slides show some examples during different types of roadway projects. The first one we'll look at is resurfacing and restoration projects. May provide an opportunity to reallocate roadway space. Consider reducing lane widths to provide a wider paved shoulder suitable for biking. And the AASHTO bicycle guide suggests the following. Note in terms of shoulder considerations. Note here on the left, we have a 14-foot overall paved section for this direction of travel, a 12-foot lane, and a 2-foot shoulder. But here we're talking about, think about maybe a 10 to 11-foot travel lane and a 3 to 4-foot shoulder. Still have our 14-foot overall width, but this with the wider shoulder, that would be a more bicycle-friendly configuration. What about rehabilitation projects? This could include complete replacement of pavements, which gives us the opportunity to add paved shoulders as the mainline pavements are replaced, or maybe a time to widen narrow paved shoulders, especially if you're adding rumble strips. What about reconstruction and new construction? Here, including paved shoulders on these projects is cost effective and should be considered both in rural and suburban arterial projects. Maybe a good time to think about other treatments like separated bike lanes, shared use paths, sidewalks. And again, these may be more desirable in urban suburban locations where you have higher pedestrian and bicycle demand. And rumble strips. I showed you an example earlier from Mississippi. The AASHTO bike guide recommends a 4-foot clear space from the rumble strip to the outside edge of the paved shoulder, or 5 feet if, as I said, if there's an obstacle or barrier like a guardrail or curb or some other obstacle. A reduced rumble strip length or edge line rumble strips or rumble stripes can be considered to provide additional shoulder width for bicycles. And just one thing to keep in mind, I always trip over this myself, but when they say rumble strip length, that's what I would call the width. So that's measured laterally along the roadway. But in rumble strip terminology, it's called the length. So they're saying use, like instead of say maybe a 10-inch rumble strip, you'd use maybe a 6-inch rumble strip or even 4-inch rumble strip to provide additional shoulder width for bicyclists. Here are just some sample cross sections. This one at the top here, I've called this undesirable for bicyclists, and notice it's a 2-foot shoulder, but what's that? Maybe a 16-inch or so, 12-inch rumble strip. So the shoulder is basically unusable by bicyclists, really, because the rumble strip takes up the entire shoulder. Here's an adequate cross section. Notice this is the narrower, the shorter length rumble strips, maybe 6 inches perhaps. And notice this is the rumble stripe where you place the pavement marking over the milled sections. That's called a rumble stripe. And so that allows some additional, in this case, they're showing greater than 4 feet or more of shoulder width. And here down below is what I'd call a constrained cross section. The shoulder is less than or equal to 4 feet. And notice part of it is taken up by the rumble strip here, which looks to be a shorter or longer than the one in the view here in the middle. So certainly the bicyclist could use this shoulder area, but I would say it's more constrained than the one above it. Also, the AASHTO Bike Guide recommends providing 12-foot minimum gaps in the rumble strips, spaced every 40 to 60 feet, to allow bikes to enter and exit the shoulder as needed, so they don't have to pass over the actual rumble strip. Or some agencies, I think, use what they call bicycle tolerable rumble strips. They're not quite as deep as a normal rumble strip, but I put a note there. The bicyclists I've talked to really don't still consider these to be very rideable. They may be called bicycle tolerable, but I'm not sure all bicyclists would agree with that. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. Notice here's the travel way in one direction, here's the edge line, and here's our edge line rumble strip. But notice here's a 12-foot or more gap, and these would be spaced, say, every 50 feet or so, so that the bicyclist can move between the traveled way and the shoulder. And studies show that this, in terms of roadway safety, this still provides the warning function for motorists that might leave the road, but also obviously is much more bicycle friendly. And to me, this would be a practice to avoid. Notice with the location of the rumble strip there, the shoulder is essentially not usable by bicyclists. Might be better to have the rumble strips here at the back edge of the shoulder. Rumble strip placement. I forget when it was. It's been a few years now, but FHWA sponsored some research that concluded that for rural 2-lane highways, and notice that's rural 2-lane highways, not for freeways or limited access roads or other classes, functional classes, rural 2-lane highways, there's no relationship between longitudinal rumble strip placement and crash reduction. So what's that saying, if you'll allow me to back up here? There shouldn't be any effect on crash reduction if we put this rumble strip at the back of the shoulder here versus here, or versus if it was, a rumble stripe here. On rural 2-lane highways, this research that Federal Highway sponsored indicated that there's really no relationship between the rumble strip placement and crash reduction. Placement according to the AASHTO criteria that I shared with you, at least 4 feet of usable pavement shoulder between the rumble strip and the edge of the paved shoulder, has the least negative impact on bicyclists. If you can't provide at least 4 feet of pavement, the rumble strip placed at the edge of the paved shoulder, and narrow it if necessary, will give the most paved shoulder to be used by bikes immediately adjacent to the travel lane. And I think I said that with respect to the previous photo I showed you. And this would be, I guess, the bicycle tolerable rumble strips, 0.375, that's 3/8 inches deep, and as narrow as 6 to 8 inches, gives this alert to drivers, but gives more space for bikes to operate. And also it's a little, not quite as deep as the conventional rumble strip, but again, still I'm not sure everyone would agree that it's bicycle tolerable. But certainly I'm a fan of the narrowing your rumble strip. What about pedestrian use of shoulders? Of course, except where it's expressly prohibited, pedestrians may legally walk on the roadway shoulders. And would we agree, although maybe not intended, most roadway shoulders can accommodate occasional pedestrian use. One thing to note, that if a shoulder is intended for use as part of the pedestrian access route, then it has to meet the ADA requirements for pedestrian facilities or walkways to the maximum extent feasible. So that would mean a 2% cross slope, at least 4 feet wide, with passing opportunities every 200 feet if it's less than 5 feet wide. But I should note, in general, a shoulder, even a paved shoulder, is not part of the pedestrian access route. But there are a few locations I'm aware of around the country where the paved shoulder has been designated as part of the pedestrian access route. And in that case, then it does need to comply with the PROAG requirements. And of course, to me, a big issue with that is how do you sort of separate the traveled way from the shoulder for the blind pedestrian? You need some sort of detectable edge or guidance surface or something to prevent the blind pedestrian from just sort of accidentally wandering out into the roadway, which is certainly not a good situation. Sidewalks and associated environments. Talk a little bit about sidewalks and their characteristics. Some of you may recognize this. This is Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. I like this photograph because I think it shows a kind of some of the nice attributes of a pedestrian facility. Notice the actual travel path or clear, unobstructed path looks like it's much wider than 4 feet, maybe 8 or 10 feet or more, which is probably good for this situation, because not only do you have maybe local residents and business people shopping or walking here, but of course Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., probably a lot of tour buses and that sort of thing. So you also have kind of a crush of tourists. So you need to have a wider facility than say 4 feet. But notice there is a lot of street furniture, which is good. There's pedestrian scale lighting, there's benches, there's street trees, probably some blocks have, information kiosks and other things. But notice that street furniture does not interfere with the unobstructed path here for pedestrians. And so from that standpoint, I think it's well done. And then on the right side of the photo, we have shop windows and storefronts, which are part of an active streetscape as well, because that's something that, attracts people's eyes. It's kind of stimulates their thoughts and their thinking. And it doesn't have to be necessarily always, sort of store windows like that. It could be just interesting architecture, of course, which there's plenty of in Washington, D.C. and many other communities around the world. But that's part of a vibrant, active pedestrian area as well, sidewalk environment as well.
Ron?
Yes, sir.
Whenever you have time, we do have a few questions.
Sure, let's do it now.
Okay, so we have a question from Cynthia. Yesterday, you had talked about car headlights and the modern cutoff pattern. So there's a multi-part question. Is the cutoff pattern the direct result of an engineer on the car manufacturer's side trying to solve light pollution? Has this been studied from a roadway safety perspective? And could this be revisited by a broader group to ensure safety for pedestrians and visibility of signs?
Yeah, very good questions. And if I miss one there, please prompt me, Mike, again. But yeah, I think and I was not involved in this, and I think probably one of the issues is I don't think the sort of the roadway engineering community was involved at all. And I don't know, but my guess is I'm not sure they were so concerned about light pollution as I think their primary goal was to sort of how can we make the headlight more intense and light up more of the road for the driver. So from that standpoint, I guess they were thinking of safety without blinding the oncoming driver, excessively. And so that's why I guess they came up with this cutoff pattern that would allow them to light up the road, but also hopefully reduce the blinding effect on other drivers. Although as an older driver, I haven't driven much since the pandemic, I have to admit, at night, but and I'm sure others of you have seen this too. I'd see all sorts of headlights that were almost blinding to me at night, even though they were probably the cutoff headlamps. But yeah, one of the key issues I think was that, as I understand it, this was just something that the automakers or the lighting companies that maybe provide the lighting components to the automakers They worked on really by themselves without any input or even any sort of notification, if you will, of the roadway engineering community. And as the question alluded to, yes, this, I think I mentioned yesterday, this has a big impact on just traffic safety generally because it has made signs less bright at night because the signs are up in that area where there is less light. And so that has affected traffic safety. One impact that's had, of course, is it has led to Federal Highway Administration back, 10 or 12 years ago, issuing what's now in the MUTCD, the minimum retroreflectivity requirements to try to make sure that state and local road agencies have signs on the road that have sufficient retroreflectivity in the sheeting to consider this situation. And of course, then on top of that, you have the baby boomers are reaching the 70s and 80s and older, and they may be out on the road driving at night. And so their nighttime visual performance is certainly not as good as a younger person. I think I shared some slides with you about that. And then the whole issue of pedestrians, in the road or near the road at night. So I forget what the last question was, but yeah, to me, this whole topic sort of begs the question of kind of some sort of joint effort where the auto industry and the traffic engineers or roadway engineers, traffic safety people, maybe even public health people get involved to try to come up with solutions to this or how to address all of these issues. Did I cover all the questions, Mike? I may have left one out.
Yeah, I think so. The last part was, could this be revisited by a broader group to ensure safety for pedestrians and visibility of signs?
Yeah, I would say definitely. Yeah. And as I said, to me, it should be very broad, not only automakers and say traffic engineers, but as I said, even public safety folks, public health, public health folks probably should be involved as well.
All right, thanks, Ron. Next question is from Ted. Will the 2011 PROAG guidelines become law?
I'm chuckling because I always get that question, even in non-ADA classes. I would say, yeah. I teach, as some of you may know, I teach a number of ADA classes, and I used to, in those classes, I used to have a slide where I gave a prediction of when PROAG would become law, but I've been shown wrong so many times, I stopped predicting anymore. But I've been talking with some folks recently. There is some thought that maybe within the next couple or 3 years that PROAG will become law. But I'll add to that is that even though it's not law yet, we should be following PROAG because the Department of Justice and Federal Highway Administration endorse it strongly and suggest that we use it in design. The courts are telling us through their decisions that we should be following PROAG. A number of agencies have adopted PROAG, state and local agencies around the country, even though it's not yet law, signed into law at the federal level. A number of state and local agencies have adopted it. And so I think it's what we should be using, even though it's not yet law. So once it's signed into law, that will be great and we'll be formalizing everything. But to me, we should be using it. The best practice, technically and also kind of to minimize legal exposure, would be to use PROAG.
All
Good
right.
question.
Thank you. Next question is from Michael. Assuming minimum shoulder width exists to use as a bike lane, what are some considerations for either marking it or not marking it with bike lane symbols?
Can we address that next week in the bike session?
Sure.
Yeah, if you don't mind, because we'll talk about that next week. I'll make a note to be sure we talk about that.
Okay. And one more question from Perry. Placing the rumble strip, well, it's a comment. Placing the rumble strip on the outside of the shoulder seems undesirable since a car will have to cross into the bike path before being alerted to leaving the lane.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Yeah. Yeah, there's obviously a number of trade-offs here involved, and I would have to agree with that. Yes.
Okay, well, those are the questions for now, and thanks everybody for submitting your questions and comments.
Thank you, Mike. And Mike and I were talking before class, and I think I said the next poll question would be near the end of class, but actually it's coming up here soon, and I'll prompt you when we're ready for it, Mike. But it'll be
Okay.
earlier than we had talked about.
All right, thanks.
Buffer strips or furniture zones or tree lawns. I saw a slide once, so there was something like 100 different names for that configuration, but they are desirable as part of the pedestrian environment. They improve pedestrian safety, make and enhance the overall walking experience. In northern areas, like where many of you in Ohio or where I am in West Virginia, they provide snow storage, some splash protection for pedestrians so they're not right at the back of the curb, give some space for street furniture. So there's a number of advantages. Although I would note, I like the kind of from a natural perspective and street scene, I like the image there that I've included here. But what troubles me is the street trees, not street trees generally. I'm a fan of street trees, but I think we have to be careful in terms of picking the right species, because that one tree looks pretty big, and that becomes a fixed object hazard for motorists that leave the road. So we do have to consider all users. But also that tree probably, we're not close enough to see, but I'll bet those tree roots are heaving up the sidewalk slabs here and creating maybe ADA issues or certainly safety issues for able-bodied pedestrians. So we do need to be careful when it comes to street trees. And in some cases, we may need to use a tree grate like you see here, both so water can reach the roots, but also so we have an accessible, that's still that 4 or 5 foot accessible route for pedestrians. And as I alluded to earlier, I think it's important to, if it's not your area, seek help or seek the expertise of an arborist or an urban forester or someone with that experience and knowledge that they can recommend and suggest appropriate tree species for this particular situation. And then also, I think I alluded to at the beginning, maintenance or tree trimming, vegetation management is important so that we don't have kind of low-hanging tree branches or limbs that can become protruding objects for the visually impaired, or really for any pedestrian, but specifically for the visually impaired. I don't know if anybody has these, but questions sometimes come up about the serpentine sidewalks. And if folks have comments or experiences, I'd be glad to hear those. But my opinion is that for a sidewalk sort of like this, it looks like it's along a road or street where you're probably going to have people like walking from home to school or home to the pharmacy or home to work or whatever it might be, where they're using walking sort of as a transportation purpose, but maybe even for moms and dads pushing strollers. People are interested in getting from point A to B in the least distance, the least effort. So a serpentine sidewalk doesn't provide that. These may be appropriate, and this is my opinion, in an area where maybe it's a historical or natural or some other area where maybe a park where people might wander slowly through an area with interpretive displays or something like that, and they're not sort of trying to get from point A to B to some destination to, like I said, to work or to school or whatever it might be. But that's my opinion. But also think about if you're a blind pedestrian using the cane trying to follow a shoreline. Man, that would be crazy, I think, to try to follow that if you were blind, or even someone in a wheelchair. You probably have to keep turning your wheelchair to navigate some of those turns, and that's just kind of an unnecessary expenditure of energy, really, to do that. Or even imagine you're the person with the skid steer or the tractor with the broom on it or something that's clearing snow off of that in the wintertime. That's not going to be a straightforward job either. So I've heard that developers like these because they look good on Google aerial photos, but from a practical sort of functional standpoint, I'm not a fan of the serpentine sidewalks. Many of you are familiar with the highway capacity manuals and the level of service concept for vehicular traffic. We might look or consider what are some of the things that go into pedestrian level of service, because really it's a totally different perspective than, motor vehicles may be considered, or looking at things, motor vehicle operators looking at things like speed and delay and spacing between vehicles and that sort of thing. Those are not really issues for pedestrians. So here are just some things that might go into considering like a pedestrian level of service. And some of these I think we've talked about already yesterday and today. One is, of course, is personal safety, meaning relating to threat of a crash with, let's say, a motorized vehicle or a bicycle even, or an e-scooter or something like that. So it's kind of personal safety with threat of a crash, conflict with other road users. But then there's also the personal security aspect, which I believe I mentioned yesterday, kind of fear of assault more generally, not a specific threat of like a traffic safety threat. And I mentioned architectural interest is a consideration. Motorists on a high-speed roadway are probably not looking at the architectural features adjacent to the road, but pedestrians can and are often interested. Pathway shade, so street trees are important. I showed you that scene from Las Vegas yesterday that lacked any sort of tree or shade at all. Pedestrian scale lighting, maybe like we saw in that Pennsylvania Avenue scene. And then amenities such as benches, for example, information kiosks where appropriate, pedestrian scale wayfinding, distances and directions to pedestrian destinations. And interestingly, the presence of other pedestrians tends to draw more pedestrians, because kind of the number of people tend to draw more. And I think you saw that maybe in that street scene I showed you in Seattle yesterday. That was a Sunday morning, but probably by afternoon, that street sidewalk may have been filled with pedestrians. I know I mentioned yesterday our trail system that we have here in the Morgantown area, and it's the same sort of thing. Boy, on a nice spring day, it's just some people show up, whether they're walking or biking or on inline skates or whatever, and it just seems to draw other people as well. It becomes kind of the hub of the community at that time. So the presence of other people will make something more attractive. And then, of course, and we'll talk about this later, conditions at intersections where pedestrians have to cross roadways or cross bicycle facilities. We need to pay attention to that, because those conflicts or potential conflicts, or how those are handled, are something to consider. Another thing to consider is where you have it, and I realize not everybody has it, but where you have it, take advantage of water. And I realize this is kind of maybe not your typical example. This is Portland, Oregon. This is sort of their waterfront. I guess this is the Willamette River, which actually has, I believe at this point, has, ocean-going vessels can travel up this far. So there's that interest of all types of maritime vessels on the river. You can see it's kind of attractive. It is drawing people. They're not really in the foreground when I took the picture, but you can see in the background a number of people. Interesting streetscape, and this attracts people and is part of an active pedestrian facility, active community. And it doesn't have to be sort of this scale. I mean, where I am in Morgantown, West Virginia, we're on the Monongahela River, which flows north to Pittsburgh. And it's interesting, I've been here over 40 years. When I first came here, really the river was sort of ignored, other than for commercial barge traffic that hauled coal out of this region. The buildings had their backs to the river, and no one would really even go near the river. But now things have changed, and I think nationwide attitudes have changed about rivers and waterways and so forth. And so now some of those buildings have been removed, industrial type buildings. We have a nice waterfront park that sort of focuses on the river. And so that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, is kind of pay attention to the water and take advantage of it rather than kind of sort of turning our back to it. And it doesn't have to be a big river like this, or even like the Monongahela River. It could be a stream or a lake. I mean, look at, I think, Madison, Wisconsin, on a lake, a beautiful situation. I think they've taken advantage of the, the lakes and so forth in that region. So look, if you have water nearby, try to take advantage of it. And consider, as we've said, pedestrian amenities, benches, lighting. Portland, Oregon does a lot with street art or urban art, all those amenities. Notice shade, a lot of trees and so forth in this urban setting. And I think at this point, Mike, if you would put up the next poll question.
Sure.
Since we've been talking about sidewalks. And this question is just, what is your biggest challenge? I realize many of you may think all of these are challenges, but what's your biggest challenge in your community with respect to sidewalks? Is it surface condition, or meeting the ADA cross slope requirement, having compliant curb ramps, sidewalk width, or if it's some other issue, if you wouldn't mind putting that in the chat box so we can hear what issues people have.
Yep, we have about 50% of the group has voted already. So we'll provide some additional time for responses. And now we're at 75%. Okay, let's see the responses. So Ron, 25% said walkway surface condition, including slip resistance. 8% said staying at or below the maximum cross slope of 2%. 37% said compliant curb ramps. 21% said sidewalk width. 10% said other, and in the questions box, comments include discontinuous walk gaps, widening to accommodate bike traffic, funding, and sidewalk condition and gaps in network.
Okay, good. Yeah, that gap issue, that probably should add that to the question. Yeah, that is a concern throughout the country.
Yeah, other full data of sidewalks.
Okay. Yeah, good, and certainly funding. Yeah, that's in there. Okay, so curb ramps are obviously a big issue then. Okay.
And Ron, do we have time for another question?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Question from Jonathan. Does PROAG give guidance on when or if to restrict bicycles from using sidewalks? He says he believes some communities have rules against bicycles from using sidewalks in high-density business areas.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I'm aware too of a number of communities around the country that do restrict bicycles from sidewalks. Again, it's kind of in the heart of the business district, as the question implied. And I'm aware some of them may make an exception for young children, just kind of for safety reasons, so they're not in the roadway. But the question was about PROAG. PROAG does not, I believe, specifically address that. But I would say that, and again, this is just personal opinion, I would say that accessibility considerations would be one reason why a community may want to ban bicycles from certain sidewalks, because of the potential conflicts. Bikes moving quickly and maybe someone with a mobility impairment not moving so quickly, or maybe they may move to the side quickly and be run down by a bike or something like that. And then, of course, the whole issue of those with visual impairments may not to be able to see the bicycle in time to take action or to make an avoidance maneuver. So I would say that those considerations, PROAG considerations, may be a reason for why you would want to ban bikes from sidewalks. Because it sometimes comes up recently, with e-scooters and other, what do we call them, micro mobility devices on the sidewalk. That is an issue that often comes up with the visually impaired community is, man, you're allowing all these other users on the sidewalk and we can't see it, we can't take appropriate action. So that is definitely a consideration. So I appreciate that question.
Great, thanks, Ron. We have a few other items. Following up on the poll question about issues with sidewalks, someone said maintenance issues and also tree damage to sidewalks. We have huge old sycamore trees that wreck sidewalks.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
And then we have a request from Anthony. Could you discuss the difference between sidewalks and multi-use paths?
Yeah, I'd probably do it from an ADA standpoint if that's okay. But if there's follow-on question, please ask it. Yeah, sidewalks typically would be part of the pedestrian access route, or at least the pedestrian, let me rephrase it, the pedestrian access route may be part of the sidewalk. The whole sidewalk doesn't need to be part of the pedestrian access route, but you need to have at least 4 feet, or in some areas 5 feet, for the pedestrian access route. So sidewalks like we're showing in my images here, or sidewalks along your streets in your community or along your residential streets or streets in your business district, those would be part of the PAR, the pedestrian access route. A multi-use trail or a shared use path usually would be a separate facility, separated from the roadway typically, I guess, but not always. And in my mind, part of that definition would be, at least from an ADA standpoint, is those paths may serve a variety of uses, recreation, so forth. But one of the uses is they serve a transportation function, meaning, as I said earlier with the Serpentine Sidewalks, people may use them to walk or bike to some destination, maybe to work or to school or to employment or to a park or something. And if there's a transportation component, and if there's a hard surface multi-use path, those paths fall under PROAG and so must comply with the PROAG requirements. Now, if you have, and I know we have people from all over the country here, but I'm thinking here in West Virginia, we have some parks, national forests where we have just a path worn in the forest floor that may wind up to some rock pinnacle that's used as a lookout. And some people call that a trail. I would call that a natural path or a recreational trail. And those would fall under the Access Board's recreational trail facilities requirements, which are different from the PROAG requirements. So I hope that answered the question. If not, please give more detail in the question box.
Thanks, Ron.
Okay, well, one more thing I wanted to mention about, and this may seem strange because it's not really a walking facility, but part of an overall pedestrian environment is what's called attractive public space, or I'll add the word attractive. I think it's just called public space. But to me, there should be attractive public space. And this is Pioneer Square in Portland, Oregon. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's kind of well known in the literature, I believe. And to me, it's kind of neat. It takes up a whole city block. I'm just showing you a portion of it here, probably not even a quarter of it. But what's neat to me as a transportation professional is, I guess decades ago, this was a block-sized parking structure. And when Portland made the decision to, I think, not have any interstates in the heart of the city and to move toward their light rail transit system, they were able to tear down the parking structure and they replaced it with this Pioneer Square, which, would you agree with me? Obviously, this is a nice day in Portland, you can see, but there must be something attractive about this because it's drawing a lot of people to this particular corner of Pioneer Square. And so we might take a minute to look at this. I mean, to me, it's colorful with the flowers, flower vegetation. it's kind of broken up. As I said, this is just one corner, and not the whole thing doesn't look like this, but even this one corner is sort of broken up in terms of space. Notice there's some sun for folks that want to sit in the sun, but there's also some shade in the background there for folks that don't want the direct sunlight. The trees in the background probably provide some wind protection, so you're not going to get wind blown sitting there. One thing you can't see behind the trees and really around all four corners or lengths of the block is there's what I'd call kind of auxiliary sort of supporting services. Like there's a lot of high-end shops, to be true, but there's also things like, you know, maybe a bookstore, Starbucks, maybe a Jimmy John's where somebody, so the point is somebody could grab a latte or grab a sandwich or grab a book and bring it out here and, you know, spend their lunch hour, for example, reading on Pioneer Square. So the reason I mention this is I go through some communities around the country, hopefully it's not your community, but I see, you know, squares like this, public spaces that are oftentimes they're fenced around with barbed wire because there may be safety or security issues, or you go by and they're vacant in the middle of a nice day. So obviously there's not something, you know, kind of attractive there that's drawing pedestrians. And it's probably as much art as it is science, but this is just sort of my list of kind of key characteristics of successful public spaces. And we've talked about a lot of these already. And there should be kind of, even if it's a big space, it kind of should be broken up into you know, smaller units that promote interaction of people. There should be kind of eyes on the street so that people in the square think that, you know, people, whether it's in the square or in the surrounding buildings, can kind of be looking out for them and can see what might be going on. There should be, you know, attractive and colorful sun and shade, wind protection. I think we've talked about all these. So with that as background, let me share with you a scene. This is the campus of West Virginia University. I don't know if I mentioned yesterday, but I spent most of my career on the faculty at WVU teaching in the civil engineering department. I'm retired now, but I was fortunate enough to have an office on the 6th floor of the 10-story engineering building. So I had a great view beyond what you see here. But I don't know, a few years ago, I was in my office. It was early April, I believe. I think it was the first day that year that the temperature went above 70 in Morgantown. You can see the trees are blossoming. And I'd been working, and I got up maybe to go to the vending machine and grab a snack for lunch or something. And I looked out the window and I saw this, and I thought, I got to capture that. Here, again, remember, this is a nice spring day on a college campus around 12 noon on a weekday. And if you look at this, maybe some of you can see someone else, but the only pedestrian I see is an individual right here. Remember what I said yesterday about pedestrians taking the shortest path? Notice all these nice sidewalks, but the one pedestrian we see is not even on the sidewalk, which I think is kind of interesting. So this is sort of the public space on this part of the WVU campus. You can see the sidewalks and you can see the landscaping. You can see some benches, and here's some detail on the benches. But let me go back to this one. Maybe think about that for a minute, and then I'll ask Mike to put up the next poll question. And I just want to get your thoughts, maybe think about public spaces yourselves, and what do you think, or what are your two biggest concerns about this space? Would you agree the fact that nobody's there at sort of a prime time when people should be kind of enjoying a public space, to me indicates there must be something, some issue here that maybe needs to be addressed. So
Ron, we ready?
Yep.
All right. We have launched the poll question.
And again, two answers to this one. Two of the, what, 4 or 5. Too symmetrical, not functional, uncomfortable seating, lacks adjoining services or amenities, or other. And if you respond to other, please, I'd appreciate it if you respond in the question box and give your specific thoughts.
All right, we have responses to the question. About 60% have voted so far. Now we're at 70%. Okay, another few seconds. And here's the results. Ron, we had 27% said too symmetrical, 34% said not functional, 33% said uncomfortable seating, 67% said lacks adjoining services or amenities, and 5% said other.
Okay, interesting.
And then with regard to the other, we have some comments in the questions box. Green spaces are nice, but should include flowers and additional seating with winding paths. And other for plaza, come on, it's engineering nearby.
Good comment. Yeah, but those others are all good comments. And yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, there is really no, it's an academic environment, so there is really not the supporting services or amenities that you might find, say, in downtown Portland or downtown anywhere. And the seating is uncomfortable, and it's really not functional. So good, I appreciate those comments. Any questions or other comments on that?
Ron, at this moment, well, we just have another comment. I feel that sometimes sidewalks are squared off and don't allow to cut corners without walking on the grass.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I share that concern. And I should note, I didn't want to influence your thinking, but one of the front door to the engineering building is over here out of view on the lower left. And the sidewalk to the library and we're lucky to have the people mover system. Some of you may be aware of that on the WVU campus. That would be this sidewalk. So probably the main pedestrian path in terms of pedestrian volume is this sort of path right here. And people often comment about why did they put, the pine tree here right in the middle? Why not just allow all those pedestrians to take a straight line path to their destination?
Ron, an additional comment submitted, it's just crossing paths, not an open gathering space or place.
Yeah, good comment. Very good comment. Yeah, I agree. Great, I appreciate those comments. Intersections where pedestrians cross the roadway or a bikeway, for example. And I realize this is an old slide, but I like it because I think it shows a lot of the intersection related issues that pedestrians face. Notice there's two arterials intersecting here. So a lot of traffic when the signal is green, probably high speed traffic. So it's interesting, notice that the agency here has just marked this crosswalk here and this one here. And the crosswalks that might involve this channelized slip lane here are not marked, and I would tend to agree with that. But notice these are fairly long crossing distances, especially for the elderly or those with disabilities, and there's no sort of median refuge area where they can cross one direction of traffic and then cross the other direction. This area down here with the channelized slip lane, really pedestrian unfriendly, really no sidewalk here apparently along the roadway. And then we talked last thing yesterday about access management, and look at these corners. This looks like old style service station. I think that's a gas pump there. So this must be a service station too. And then there's something over here, but notice the driveways close to the intersection. So pedestrians not only have to contend with sort of through traffic on the arterial, but they may have to worry about traffic turning in and out of the land uses close to the intersection. So this is really not a pedestrian friendly environment at all. Design guidance would be design all your intersections with the assumption that pedestrians are going to be present. And I show this as an exception, but really this is probably unique maybe in the world. I don't know if anybody's been to Las Vegas. Sure, some of you have, but as you may recall, years ago, Las Vegas had a serious pedestrian safety issue, not only at intersections, but just along roadways generally. Pedestrians would just cross sort of anywhere between blocks, and they had a serious safety issue. But one thing they've done at intersections is they just really prevent pedestrians from crossing at grade. And of course, they had the benefit, I guess, of these casinos that, as I understand it, helped contribute significantly financially. But for example, here, the crossing is, you can go up a stair or an escalator, or there's also an elevator. And then notice there's a nice, fairly wide bridge structure that crosses over. And then again, there's elevators, escalators, stairs, depending on what your wishes and abilities are in terms of mobility to descend to street level. And they have, just barely out of view here on the left, you can see the stairs or the escalators, but that exists on all four approaches to the intersection. And notice, I said yesterday, if you don't want pedestrians in the street or the intersection, you really need to put up barriers. And these are pretty significant barriers above and beyond just accessibility. They really don't want anybody in the street. As I recall, this particular one actually had a sawtooth sort of edge here on the top. So I mean, they don't even want you sort of, grabbing that and vaulting over it or anything. But apparently this has been very successful, and their pedestrian crash rate has declined significantly because you don't see any pedestrians in the intersection. But most of us don't have that luxury to have grade separated crossings on our intersection approaches. So we need to design all intersections assuming pedestrians will be present. Some intersection design principles related to pedestrians. Encourage pedestrians to cross at the corners. Make sure pedestrians are visible to traffic, and likewise, make vehicular traffic visible to pedestrians so they can see it. Try to make pedestrian actions predictable. Minimize the time pedestrians are in the road. Try to shorten the crossing distance, and do what we can to slow or calm vehicular traffic. Sight distance, I mentioned, I think it's critical. One way to improve sight distance is to install curb extensions. Make sure you trim your vegetation, and also kind of avoid clutter at the intersection. This is kind of a tale of two corners, I guess. They're in different communities, but notice we have the curb extensions or bulb outs here. I'm not sure they have compliant detectable warnings at the base of those ramps, but I like this design because notice first, the curb extension allows the pedestrian to be out here. So if there's parked vehicles here, which there weren't the morning this photo was taken, but it allows pedestrians to better see oncoming traffic, and likewise traffic can see the pedestrian. And I like it because I know it looks sort of plain, but and ordinary, but it does have good sight lines. The one here on the right, which looks like a newer design, and some would say maybe is more attractive, more aesthetically pleasing. But the issue I have with this is notice the size of these planters and the vegetation in those planters. There could be a person in a wheelchair or a child walking toward the intersection here, toward the crosswalk, that a driver on this approach may not even see. So this concerns me from a safety standpoint, and I don't think provides adequate sight lines. So my point is, be careful in your, I don't have an issue with putting planters and things there, but let's use appropriate design that doesn't interfere with sight lines. I mentioned earlier the channelized slip turn lanes. These are a bane even for able-bodied pedestrians, let alone visually impaired pedestrians. Because if you think about it, this vehicle that we see here making this right turn, that radius is such that they can make that turn at fairly high speed. And if you think about it, the attention of the driver is focused over their shoulder here. They're looking for a gap in traffic so they can merge. they're not really paying attention or expecting pedestrians or bicyclists kind of in front of them. So an issue is, how can we design that situation to make it more friendly for the vulnerable users? So here's some guidance. Kind of keep the turn lane as narrow as the vehicle, as the design vehicle allows, usually not more than 14 feet. Have the pedestrian crossing at 90 degrees across the turn lane and placed at the approach end of the island. Make sure your sight lines are good, unobstructed, and the islands have to be curbed to be detectable. You can't use painted islands, they have to be detectable. So that would be these islands. These islands here have to be curbed islands, so they are detectable. And here are some of the details of a, let's say, pedestrian friendly, if there is such a thing, a right turn slip lane, or at least one that's better than the kind of the conventional design. And notice it has kind of a different radii, 50 to 60 degree angle between vehicle flows. Notice the crosswalk here is one car back from the yield line here, or the stop line. And of course, these are raised islands. And one interesting thing, that agencies that have started using this design, kind of an unintended consequence, is that they're finding not only do they have better pedestrian safety performance, but also this design reduces rear end crashes between motor vehicles. And as you may be aware, these right turn slip lanes, not only are they issue for pedestrians, but they tend to have a high frequency of rear end crashes. So this design not only is better for pedestrians, but it tends to improve vehicular safety, traffic safety overall. Use of marked crosswalks to control pedestrian movements, help promote a connected pedestrian network, provides visibility for both pedestrians and drivers of the crossing place. There are some issues. Where do we locate them? What marking types? What about lighting? What about maintenance? Crosswalk markings. I said it gives guidance for pedestrians crossing the roadway. It defines the path, especially helps low vision pedestrians. So there should be enough contrast between the white marking material and the roadway surface so that low vision pedestrians can navigate across the street. Lets drivers know that there's a pedestrian crossing point, especially if it's a mid-block crossing. The crosswalk markings legally establish the crosswalk. Here are some crosswalk marking designs. Maybe the standard one is the two parallel lines, like you see here. Here's a diagonal or zebra design. Related to this would be the ladder design, where the crossing markings are at right angles rather than skewed like you see here. And maybe recently the more popular one might be the continental design, which is a little different. Notice it doesn't have the outside lines like the other designs have, but it has gaps in the, has plenty of marking material and gaps here. And if you line these gaps up with the wheel paths, you can kind of extend the life of your marking material. And so really, probably all of these would be appropriate marking patterns. I would add that notice the diagonal here, the zebra or the ladder, and the continental, notice they have more marking material, and so they are more visible to drivers. And I think I just said that. Some of you may have raised crosswalks where the crosswalk is on top of a speed table or speed hump. And that's a good way to get some traffic calming. It also elevates the pedestrians a few inches, maybe improves drivers' ability to see the pedestrian. But because the crosswalk surface up here is at the same elevation as the sidewalk, we need to have for ADA, for the visually impaired, we need to have the truncated dome detectable warning surfaces on both sides of the crosswalk. It's hard to tell with the leaves if they exist here in the photo. It almost looks like maybe they don't, but there should be detectable warning surfaces at this end and at this end here, if they're not. Try to design the crosswalk with the fewest possible conflict points with traffic and the short crossing distances. Make sure the markings are in alignment with the connecting sidewalks. Countdown signals, beneficial to pedestrians. In terms of pedestrians can make a judgment, do they have time to cross the street or not? I think their benefits, safety benefits, have been demonstrated. What about walk indications for signalized intersections? ProAg requires an audible and vibrotactile walk indication. The audible walk indication, tone or speech, depending on the spacing of the push buttons. The vibrotactile, meaning the surface vibrates when the walk indication is on, so that someone with a vision and hearing impairment can know when the walk indication is on. And the push buttons need to be located close to and in alignment with the crosswalk. Median islands, I mentioned those earlier. I think these are good to help with pedestrians. We call them a pedestrian refuge area in some cases. We'll talk about what the definition of that is. But here, a pedestrian can cross this direction of traffic and then wait safely in this refuge area and then cross, make the second stage crossing, if you will, to cross the other direction of the street. And you can see, depending on the dimensions and other characteristics, they may actually be an attractive enhancement or green space in the community. Federal Highway Administration has identified pedestrian refuge areas as one of their proven safety countermeasures. Maybe where they're pushing the use of pedestrian refuge islands. Demonstrated 46% reduction in pedestrian crashes, so that's significant. The AASHTO PED guide says consider refuge areas where the crossing exceeds 60 feet. And I think in that initial image I showed you, that older aerial photo, that those crossing distances, as I recall, were more than 60 feet. In terms of design, the refuge islands must be a minimum of 6 feet in the direction of travel. You can have an island that's less than 6 feet, but it would be considered a pass-through or a cut-through. In other words, we don't want pedestrians hanging out there. It's not a refuge island. So the refuge island must be a minimum of 6 feet in the direction of pedestrian travel. And just something to consider, say you have a trail crossing a roadway, or like a shared use path or multi-use trail, as we talked about, there you may want to think about having a minimum distance in the direction of travel, pedestrian travel or bike travel, to be 10 feet to accommodate a bike with a trailer. Again, not recommending that for every crossing, but maybe where you have a shared use path or trail crossing a roadway, you may want to think about, if you have a refuge area, make it 10 feet rather than 6 feet. And the refuge areas need to be at least 5 feet wide. And here's an example. Notice, again, breaking that long crossing up or complex crossing up into two simpler crossings. So the pedestrian can wait down here and they can check. You see their kind of field of view here. They can check for traffic in one direction. They don't have to worry about traffic in both directions. Then they cross. And this has to be some sort of, again, raised island, so it's detectable to the visually impaired. But then they can wait safely in this refuge area, and then they just have to worry about checking traffic to their right, and then they cross at right angles. A flush median is not a refuge area or island for pedestrians. Look at this family here. I guess I don't like this at all, but I would say it's probably not as bad as some I've seen or some we have here in my city here in Morgantown. At least it looks like there's not a whole lot of driveways around there, so you don't have a whole lot of left turning traffic. But we have areas in Morgantown where we have, you know, fast food establishments and restaurants and coffee shops and hotels and stores and other things on both sides of the street, and there's vehicles turning left and right pretty much at all times, plus the through traffic on the arterial. And I think over the years, I think we've had 2 fatal pedestrian crashes. Both happened at night, both involving left turning vehicles, and it probably because the left turning drivers don't expect pedestrians and they can't see them at night, and so it's just not a good combination. Think about enhanced crossing treatments, whether it's mid-block or at an intersection. Crossing locations should offer adequate gaps between the vehicles and encourage motorists yielding or stopping. What does the AASHTO PED guide say about mid-block crossings? It says they're preferred because pedestrians should not be expected to make excessive or inconvenient diversions in their travel path to cross at an intersection. In all locations, enhanced pedestrian crossing treatments should be considered based on the number of vehicle travel lanes, the speed of traffic, and the volume of vehicular traffic. And by enhanced treatments, they mean it could be signing, flashing lights, could be a raised crosswalk, speed table, something like that, something above and beyond just marking the crosswalk and putting in the standard crosswalk signing. When do you mark a crosswalk? This is always an issue, I think. And the MUTCD says we shouldn't mark crosswalk lines, or crosswalk lines should not be used indiscriminately. Before a mid-block crosswalk is installed, a traffic engineering study should be done that considers things like the number of lanes, distance to adjacent intersections, pedestrian and vehicle volumes, vehicle speeds. I'd add to that pedestrian crash experience, and probably also look at the area around it. You may not, for example, have much pedestrian traffic now, but that may be because pedestrians are kind of apprehensive about crossing there. But there may be certain land uses that if an appropriate, you know, and with enhanced treatments and so forth, crosswalk was installed, it might attract more pedestrians. So we need to keep that in mind as well. And think about, you know, in some cases, high traffic volumes and speeds, think about crossing islands, refuge areas, signals, or signing, or as I mentioned, even speed tables. FHWA says substantial crossing improvements recommended to supplement marked crosswalks under any of the following conditions: where the speed limit exceeds 40 miles per hour and either on a roadway with 4 or more lanes without a raised median and an ADT of 12,000 vehicles per day or greater, or on a roadway with 4 or more lanes with a raised median and an ADT of 15,000 vehicles per day or greater. Additional treatments include advanced yield and stop lines and signing. I think we'll talk about this, and then time's running out, then we'll wrap it up. But a big issue, and maybe some of you have this in your community if you have multi-lane roadways, are the multiple threat crashes, which is illustrated here. Notice we have a mid-block crosswalk, 2 lanes in each direction. Car A here sees the pedestrian and stops or yields to the pedestrian, but by so doing, car B cannot see the pedestrian, and likewise, car A is sort of screening so the pedestrian can't see car B, and then the pedestrian and the vehicle collide here. This is a serious issue. In fact, in the last probably 3 years, we've had 2 pedestrian fatalities in Morgantown. Both have been the multiple threat type, so it is a serious issue. The solution is to, if you can, move the stop or yield line back, further back. So now car A is stopped here, And notice car B can still see the pedestrian, and hopefully we'll be able to stop here, or certainly stop short of the crosswalk. So here's an example of the solution. I think the MUTCD talks about a 20 to 50 foot setback. I think this is about 30 feet, but notice the vehicle stopped here, and the vehicles alongside them should not interfere with each other's sight lines to see the pedestrians. And I think we're out of time, Mike, so I think I'll stop here. We'll pick up here next week. We'll thank everybody for participating. Thanks for the great input and questions today, and I'll turn it back to you, Mike, for final comments.
Yes, thanks, Ron, and we look forward to part 3 of this series next week. So thanks everyone for attending today.